is the world getting better? Like a very, very vanishingly small percentage of people actually say that. So most people across society and across countries say that the world is getting worse. Climate change is a catastrophic risk which could have very, very large impacts for a large number of countries across the world. But I don't see it as an existential risk where most of the human population are wiped out by it. But as I say, that doesn't mean we don't need to work on it, Rick. Being a catastrophic risk is more than enough for us to take action.
We've got these billionaires who seem to be ever more powerful. Presumably, this is the one indicator which goes against your trend of things getting better, right? We're getting less and less equal. Poor are getting poorer, the rich are getting richer, right?
Not quite. I think it's a bit more complicated than that.
Welcome to Saving the World from Bad Ideas. I'm Mark Lynas, and I've had a few bad ideas in my time. I used to go out in the nighttime to destroy GMO crops, and I also opposed nuclear power. But then when I looked at the science, I found I got it wrong. Oops. I've learned the hard way that none of us are right all the time. So now I'm here to challenge the assumptions that we all too often take for granted, because the future depends on us getting it right. Well, hi there, Hannah. Thanks so much for joining us on the Saving the World from Bad Ideas podcast. Are you in Edinburgh?
I am in Edinburgh, yeah. It's great to be here having the conversation.
I have a little bottle of scotch which lives on my shelf. Is it? Do you drink scotch? Is it?
I mean, not usually at 2 p.m.
No, I was thinking I could crack this out after we've done an hour. But if we struggle, I'll start earlier. But anyway, no, it just reminded me of you talking to you from Scotland. I went to Edinburgh University, so it's a place I know well and have much love for. Anyway, your Not the End of the World book has done just incredibly well. It's so amazing to see just how many people have read it and just how much it's been celebrated and by so many big names around the world. You've been on Bill Gates's podcast, you've been on Ezra Klein, which I listen to, and it's a fantastic podcast too. But tell me, what's it like to be famous?
I mean, now I'm on this podcast, so I've reached the pinnacle. No, I mean, it's been a good experience. Like, I've always wanted to publish a book. And like, I'm happy with how it's went. I mean, doing all of that stuff was quite overwhelming. It was kind of out of my comfort zone, but I guess that's part of what this is all about. But yeah, no, I've enjoyed it, and I've also just learned a ton. Like, even just doing media around it and doing interviews and answering questions, you just learn a lot about how other people think and what their perspectives are. So yeah, it's been good.
I mean, being a famous data nerd, can I call you that? I mean,
of course you can, yeah. I mean, I don't know about the famous, but I think you're exaggerating that a little. But.
Well, it's almost like a contradiction in terms, but you seem to have managed to scale the heights and be, well known and get a lot of attention for trying to tell what's actually always a fairly complicated and nuanced story that doesn't fit kind of conventional narratives that people have, right?
Yeah, I mean, at the heart of my work and at the heart of the book is data and trying to understand the world through the lens of data, which on the surface probably doesn't seem that attractive to most people. And we generally know, right, that like just presenting data to people is not that effective in changing their minds. It's like how you combine data with a compelling narrative often is like how you start to win people over and convince them. So yeah, I try to do that a bit with the book and weave in a bit of narrative. But yeah, I think I've carved out a small niche for myself where it's this combination of research, data visualization, okay writing, and a bit of heart in there as well.
It's better than okay. Don't undersell it. And I'm sure it's been, I'm sure you've had good sales figures as well, because it's just had so much attention. But you have. I was just skimming through the beginning of the book just before we talked, and I see you have a Hans Rosling sort of origin story for how your kind of conversion. I mean, for me, watching his video I did get to see him live actually in Oxford, but before that, I remember watching his video, Hans Rosling and the Magic Washing Machine. Which was just probably the best piece of data communication that I've ever seen in my life. It was just, and it was his charisma and his kind of, I don't know how he had it. He just had this incredibly appealing way of delivery. So what was your story with him?
Yeah, no, I mean, he's been a big inspiration for me, and I think it's very, very hard to mimic what he did in terms of finding that compelling narrative and delivering it in a in a very human, but also just like quite blunt and straightforward way. He somehow managed to, and I say this in the book, he somehow manages to point out that you're thinking about this in a stupid way, but he does it in a way that you're not angry for him for it, and you actually feel relatively convinced.
He did a show at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and he had them versus the chimpanzees, right? So the chimpanzees were like answering a question randomly, and they were trying their best, and the chimpanzees won on things like population, because the biases of even the America's top scientists were so profound that they didn't even understand the basics of the world around them. And he somehow managed to show that in a way that had them all laughing, and presumably they kind of get on board and realize that rather than just rejecting it. Anyway, tell us your story.
Yeah, so my background is environmental science. That's kind of what I grew up as. I kind of grew up as a climate change kid that was really concerned about climate change. And I did all my studies on environmental science at university. And as I describe in the book, like I kind of reached this place where I felt very, very helpless to do anything about these problems. It seemed so overwhelming, and it seemed like just everything was getting worse. And by everything, I don't just mean all of the environmental problems, but also many of the kind of human development well-being problems, right? So I was looking at the news a ton, and there you're just seeing disaster after disaster after disaster. So in my head, I just had this kind of understanding of the world of just everything's getting worse and worse and worse. And then I discovered the work of Hans Rosling, and he kind of flipped that upside down for me, because he didn't really cover the environmental metrics that much. He focused more on the human development side of things. But as you say, he pointed out that many of the very, very basic facts about the world, like is global extreme poverty falling, are fewer children dying, how many people are dying in disasters, most of us, we don't just guess it wrong, we actually have a bias in the wrong direction where we think everything's getting worse. And when you step back to look at the data, which he did, you see that many of these things have been getting much, much better. And I think that was really a pivotal moment for me of realizing, not everything is getting worse, but it also opened up to me the value of stepping back and looking at the data to understand these range of problems, and then ultimately how we go on to solve them.
Yeah, I mean, we spoke to Steven Pinker in the previous recording, and he has this rather clever phrase. I think he says that the news is a non-random sample of the worst things that happened in the world that day. And of course, if you have this day after day, then you end up with a completely skewed view of what's happening in the world. And so that really is what you've tried to do, isn't it? Is to try to correct the negativity bias that we get simply from everyday media, right?
Yeah, but I think that comes from an unfortunate mix of human psychology. I think in some sense we're programmed to look for the bad stuff or the kind of emergency or danger that's going on, and that's embedded in us. And then combine that with the kind of a media environment that we're in, where it is this kind of second by second, what's the worst thing that happened in the last hour? And you just kind of get this terrible mix of negativity bias. And I think that's the position I was in. I think that's still a position a lot of people are in. And yes, part of my work is trying to step back and say, how are things actually changing? Are things getting better? Where are they not getting better, right? It's not just everything's getting better, but stepping back to take in the bigger picture. And I think it gives you a slightly different perspective.
I mean, do you sometimes feel you're fighting a losing battle? Because it just seems like pessimism is so in at the moment, like the whole far-right resurgence around the world. I mean, Trump's MAGA movement is essentially a pessimistic movement. Everything's getting worse. We've got to turn the clock back. We've got to stop things happening. The idea that we're living in the best time ever to live in, it seems absurd and you get the same from the left, of course, like conventional environmentalism is pretty pessimistic. People saying they won't have children. I mean, you write about this in the book as well. Do you have data about whether this is a trend which is getting worse or not, as it sort of seems to me at an anecdotal level?
I mean, I think there isn't good data on these types of attitudes over time, but if you look at polls, cross-country polls on one of the basic stuff that Hans Rosling would cover and would do these kind of surveys on, but just generally, like, is the world getting better? Like a very, very vanishingly small percentage of people actually say that. So most people across society and across countries say that the world is getting worse. And I think if you were to look at data over the last few years in particular, I think that share would be even higher. So I think this is just a very, very widespread problem. And I do think I'm in a bit of a kind of fringe or niche by putting forward a slightly different perspective.
Mm. And of course, there's problems with pessimism, right? And particularly if it leads to kind of doomerism, which is another thing that, those of us in environmental movements have come across a lot, in that it leads to kind of an opposition to solutions and also an opposition to technology. There's kind of an anti-technology bias, isn't there, with a lot of doomy thinking, like whatever it is that you invent, it's inevitably going to go wrong. It's going to cause bigger problems than it's trying to solve. Like, how kind of important do you think that perspective is?
I mean, I think there are a couple of issues with kind of blanket pessimism. I think, or more cynicism. I think cynicism is probably a better phrase than just pessimism. I think one is this fatalism, where if you just think there's just no chance that we're ever going to solve problem X, and problem X can be anything, then you just lead towards giving up, right? There's no point in trying if the battle's already lost, or if you can't recognize that there's ever been any progress on any of these problems. Why on earth would you think we're in this unique place where suddenly progress would happen, right? So there's this sense of fatalism, which is damaging because I think it leads to inaction. And then I think maybe another issue with kind of really strong levels of cynicism is that I think if you get to the point where you're so desperate to solve a problem, you can't see a way out of it, sometimes the reaction is to grasp for very, very extreme interventions, and very, very extreme interventions that would never get the society-wide support that they would need in order to be enacted. So you often have circles that will reach for really extreme solutions, which actually increases resistance to solving the problem. So if you take climate change, for example, sometimes if you reach for a really extreme solution to solving climate change, you get this kind of resistance and backlash with the rest of society. They don't want to uptake that extreme solution. So I think that's the other issue with pessimism.
Well, or extreme measures like putting RFK Jr., the nation's leading anti-vaxxer, in charge of the America's health service. I mean, that comes from cynicism, right?
Yeah. No, it comes from cynicism about many of the health problems that we've already solved, right? Like, often this is rolling back progress on whether it's vaccines or other health interventions that have actually made really amazing progress on not eradicating, we've eradicated one disease, but reducing the burden of many diseases and reducing deaths. Part of this reaction is a backlash to these interventions in some sense, because we're probably not loud enough about the progress that has been made on this because of these interventions.
Yeah. You have as I've just got the book here. The subtitle is How We Can Be the First Generation to Build a Sustainable Planet. So this first generation, you've got this sort of concept of, almost like a youth movement. We've started building a youth movement at We Planet, and we're trying to think through really what a youth movement which was had not doomy like Fridays for Future, like Greta Thunberg's was rather, but had a positive view of the future, and whether that's even possible to do. Because it's one thing to sort of get young people angry because their future's being stolen from them, and they've got to take extreme measures to, like, school strikes or whatever, to try and combat that. Do you think it's even possible to have a first generation type youth movement?
I think it's possible. I think there is some balance there. What I think is really important is being able to offer people a vision of the future that's better than it is today. And I actually think that some of the reason why some of our environmental messaging, and I've been part of the kind of environmental movement, so I'm part of this, I think where we've gone wrong is, like, too often we are just framing it as a damage limitation exercise, right? So the future is framed as inevitably worse than it is today, and we just decide how bad it's going to be, right? Rather than actually presenting, no, the future can be better than it is today, but it will take effort and action in order to get us there. So I think you do need to offer people a positive vision that we can work towards. But I think in some sense there is also room for people being driven by anger. I think young people do have a right to be angry about some of the positions that they've been put in and the kind of uphill battle we have in order to tackle these problems. But there needs to be some balance there. I think you can initially be sparked by anger, but I think it's hard to hold on to that anger for a really long and extended period of time and make progress on these problems.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really at the heart of it, though, in that it's quite difficult to correct environmental doom mongering as a kind of a framing device. You know, XR, Extinction Rebellion, had this strapline, "Tell the truth," but their own science wasn't exactly straight from the IPCC. You know, there was no nuance there at all. And you know, I wrote a piece, a blog post actually, just kind of gently correcting some of Roger Hallam's, who's one of the XR founders, and very unfairly, by the way, is currently still in jail. But correcting his assertion, I think, on a BBC radio thing about there being 2 billion people inevitably going to die in the next decade or whatever. And, I thought, well, I wonder what the science is there. And I looked it up. And of course, this isn't in the IPCC. It's not in any mainstream climate science. I think it was a paper that was written in some obscure journal by a musicologist. And that was what he was citing. And that's what, his passionate appeal to people to take measures which are going to put them in jail potentially through civil disobedience or whatever is based on a paper by a musicologist. I mean, how do you try to push back, and how do you have a science-based movement which has that passion but which is actually trying to tell the truth?
I mean, I think it's important to distinguish between driving engagement and driving action. And I think when it comes to, and the data is also very clear on this, when it comes to people's general concern about climate change and their want to see more action, and actually in every country, it's already there, right? If you want to frame this as different steps we need along the way, or different challenges we need along the way to get to a low carbon or zero carbon society, the first step of getting people on board with this is a problem and we need to do something about it, we've done it, right? Of course, there's still there's still a small percentage of people in every country that doesn't believe in climate change, but we don't need to bring them on board. We're fine as we are. We're a majority as we are. So, and since that step is already done, the question is how you then take people from that step to them actually taking action and implementing, whether it's policies or individual behaviours or finance decisions, to where we need to be. And I think the messaging and narrative you need to do that is not the same as what you need for the first bit. And I think some of the issues that we're still, because, and I come from a climate background, but we're so set on the first bit of convincing people that climate change is happening or is going to be bad, and I think we've got stuck there. And I think in some sense, yes, we need to keep reminding people of why we're doing this, but we also need to move on to the next stage, which is providing a compelling narrative for why people would want to get rid of their petrol car or get an electric heat pump or support a wind farm or solar farm in their neighbourhood. I think the way that you drive that and engage that is different from the first step.
Yeah, I think there's probably also a bit of an element of noble cause corruption. I think that's the term where you kind of give a pass to extreme claims on the pro-climate side because you think, well, at least that's going to motivate action. At least it's pushing in the right direction, whereas you would, strongly push back against climate denial on the other side of the ledger. So I don't know, does that even have any base in psychology, or is it literally just tribalism?
I mean, there's probably some psychological basis for that as well. There's definitely, obviously, a confirmation bias where as soon as you see a claim that supports what you think is correct or your side, or bolsters that, I think you're much more likely to reshare it or believe in it. I think there is the concept of the kind of noble lie, which I think is what you're getting at here, where if there's a claim made that supports your cause, you kind of give it a pass that you wouldn't give the other side if they were making a similarly thingy claim. And I think one example here is At our own data, we've done a lot of work on data on natural disasters and how natural disasters are changing and how deaths are changing. And there's this large international database that's kind of the largest in the world that collects this data. And obviously, the further you go back in time, the patchier the data is, right? We don't have amazing records of how many people died in 1904 in disasters, right? We only really capture the big ones that make it into the history books, and many of the smaller ones are just missing. But anyway, if you look at this data, they started collecting this data kind of in the 1970s, 1980s. That's when they started collecting this data in the database. So over the next few decades, you see a rise in the number of disasters that are being recorded in the database, right? Because the records are improving, we've got better surveillance, etc. The data source, the database themselves are very clear, like don't interpret this as a actual increase in the number of disasters that are happening, because there's a lot of stuff going on here and a lot of it is increases in reporting. But it's still, you still hear like heads of the UN quoting that the number of disasters has quadrupled over the last 30 or 40 years. And that's just like not the case, right? Even if number of natural disasters has increased a bit, the number hasn't quadrupled over the last 30 or 40 years. But I think that framing has had very, very little pushback because it's actually useful as a message for why we need to take action on climate change. So I think in some sense there is a little bit this kind of noble lie comes in.
Think of Roger Pielke Jr.'s work. I mean, he's been sort of expelled from polite society because he's pointed out this basically statistical, and plus it's in the IPCC. But this supposed increase in disasters is always attributed to climate change, of course, which is why there's this why it is given this free pass, as you say.
I think that's quite tough to tackle, right? If you come out and say that, you're kind of framed as undermining the issue, which obviously I'm not, and I'm a massive supporter of us getting on and tackling climate change because I think it is a massive problem. So there's some kind of reputational risk of sticking your neck out and saying that's not quite what the data says or that's not what the source says. We should interpret it as. And I think there is also just some risk. Like I think the more of these statements that are confidently made and repeated again and again, if you are concerned about kind of the other side, the more denial side, gaining traction, this is just like so easy for them to pick up these statements and say, look how everyone's lying. And it has the risk of completely undermining all of climate science if the other side can make a big deal out of these claims that are being falsely repeated again and again. So I think that's the risk.
Yeah, so I mean, you're basically helping us, in my view, as a kind of corrective within to help environmentalism to be more evidence-based, which has got to be good because then it's identifying problems in the most data-driven way and hopefully helping frame solutions. And it makes it more, as you say, it makes it more robust to attacks if it actually is more based on mainstream science. But has there been much pushback? Because the obvious narrative framing, I think there's been right-wing press coverage for the book, right? Because it's sort of seen as being, showing environmental problems aren't nearly as bad as those annoying Greens have always been saying. Whether it's climate or fisheries or plastics, it's not as bad as you've been told. It's very kind of Lomborg if that's the framing that you allow. I mean, have deniers taken up the book? Have you had pushback from Greens? What was the reception sort of been for this whole thing?
I'd say there wasn't that much uptake from disingenuous right wing. There's been a couple of media articles. I think the Daily Mail had one that I wasn't happy about, where they do it suits them to have this narrative, as you say, that environmental problems are not as bad as you've been told. When actually my message is, yeah, maybe not as bad as some of them aren't as bad as you've been told, but they're worse than most Daily Mail readers would think they are. So it's kind of the opposite message that I would want them to get, that these are big problems and you should take them more seriously. I mean, I think there definitely has been criticism, pushback with this message that by in some sense calling out some of the noble lies or trying to tell a more evidence-based story takes away some of the urgency in order to tackle these problems, right? I think there's the framing that in order for people to wake up and realize how important these issues are and to drive them to action, you need to tell the worst case scenario, and you need people to understand that these are. And I think there is some sense that some of this messaging can underplay the action that's needed, which obviously was not my intent, and I would hope that's not what people get from the book. But I think that is the criticism that came through.
I mean, the boundaries of what's permissible in the climate space are often pretty narrow, and there's a lot of kind of pressure within the kind of, I don't know, within the discourse, if you like, not to step outside it. And I find this with 1.5 of the Paris Agreement limit. And, I work with developing countries and small island states with the Climate Vulnerable Forum, and that's been their demand. They were there in Paris saying 1.5 to stay alive, right? Now we're at 1.5, and nobody still within the COPs, at least, nobody in Baku was there saying, right, it's too late for 1.5, let's look and see what this actually means. It's almost kind of denial on the pro-climate side that this is even happening.
Yeah, I mean, I've also found 1.5 hard, even since, as soon as the Paris Agreement happened, because to me, even back then, realistically, we were never going to keep temperatures below 1.5. And I think it's still very useful to have a stretch goal, right? Like, you don't want to make the targets too lax that they're easy, right? You should have a stretch goal that people really need to work hard to achieve. But I think some of the issue I've found is around the messaging for 1.5, where some of the biggest misconceptions I think people have about climate science is that 1.5 is some cliff we fall off or some threshold where we have this kind of runaway global warming effect. Or I think that's a very common misconception within the public. And the reality, and as I say in the book, the reality is that we are going to pass 1.5 degrees, and we're going to pass 1.5 degrees because we won't reduce emissions quickly enough. So for the public, this contradiction is really hard, right? Because on one hand, I'm saying 1.5 degrees is never going to happen. And on the other, in their head, they have 1.5 degrees kind of is the end of the world and we're going to fall off a cliff. And that's just not true when it comes to the climate science. So I think there is some reconciliation that people need to do there in order to understand that, yes, 1.5 degrees isn't going to happen. And we should actually probably be quite honest about that, because people need to prepare for a world that's going to be 1.6 or 1.7 or 1.8 degrees warmer. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that we should give up and it's game over, right? We just need to fight for every 0.1 of a degree more than that. But that's quite a hard and nuanced discussion to have with people. And often when you have it, either it comes across as you saying 1.5 degrees is not that bad, or in some way undermining the ambitions to keep temperatures as low as possible.
Well, and I think the origin for this was because 1.5 wasn't a scientifically derived target limit. It was, the IPCC was asked after the Paris Agreement to come back and tell us what 1.5 versus 2 degrees actually meant, and they had a special report on this. But the 1.5 degree limit came from campaigners, really. But it's sort of become understood as if we cross 1.5, then there will be tipping points. But it's, we just don't know where these tipping points are. We think they almost certainly exist in the climate system in different ways, but we certainly don't have any clear understanding of, what the temperature limits are for different tipping points, right?
Yeah, exactly. But I think it's becomes clear that in some sense, both 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees, although they're very valuable targets, are still somewhat arbitrary. And the reason you know that is because they're round numbers, right? Like, it would be very circumspect that within the climate system, it would be exactly 1.5 degrees and exactly half a degree, i.e. 2 degrees, would be the next one. But I think the communication of that has been very difficult.
I mean, we could just say, let's stop at 2 degrees and do geoengineering, like with sulfates. What do you think? What do you think to that proposal? Not that anyone makes it, by the way. It's not a proposal anyone even dares to make, or we're not even supposed to have the conversation. But how do you handle that issue?
I mean, on geoengineering, I'm kind of in the camp of we should put small amounts of funding to understand what the impacts would be, what the true cost would be. The the argument is often made, I think quite validly, that we could actually relatively cheaply cool the planet by X amount, and we can determine what X amount is. I think the problem with that framing is that I don't think we know quite enough about the knock-on impacts of that to really truly gauge the costs, right? Like the upfront costs of deploying the technology, we need to do that, might be cheap, but you don't know. We currently don't know the whole system level effects, and that could actually just be very, very expensive and very catastrophic in some ways. So I'm generally in favor of small amounts of funding to understand that better, but I wouldn't commit to some threshold and then just say, let's just go for it and kill the planet by X amount.
Yeah, I mean, the termination shock issue in geoengineering is often framed as an existential risk. And you do actually have a line in the book where you say, I think you more or less say climate isn't an existential risk, unlike pandemics or nuclear war, which I have sympathy with because I've just written a book on nuclear war, which is coming up fairly soon. And yeah, that really is an existential risk. I mean, we can basically destroy the biosphere and human civilization within a matter of hours. And, you know, I say rather flippantly that it stopped me worrying about climate change. I can sleep at night now. But, you know, it just doesn't compare. I mean, climate has lots of off-ramps, there's adaptation, there's all sorts of measures you can take to protect people's lives in the future and also to, you know, protect ecosystems hopefully too. So how do you handle that issue as well in terms of what is and isn't an existential risk?
Oh, I mean, I think the key thing to not misunderstand there is a risk doesn't need to be catastrophic for us to work existential for us to work really, really hard on it, right? Like that in no way means, let's not worry about it because it's not existential. Only X billion people would die rather than all 8 billion of us. That's not the correct framing. We can work on many problems at the same time. I mean, the way I frame it is I think climate change is a potentially catastrophic risk, which could have very, very large impacts for a large number of countries across the world. But I don't see it as an existential risk where most of the human population are wiped out by it. But as I say, that doesn't mean we don't need to work on it. Like having it being a catastrophic risk is more than enough for us to take action.
I don't know how you are with just recalling numbers from memory, but can we go through some of the issues that you talk about in Our World of Data and also in the book?
Yeah.
And if you don't have a number, don't quote it. I'm sure you wouldn't make it up. I'm not saying you have to say 49% in 1952 or anything like that, but let's look at infant mortality, maternal mortality, some of these indicators that you go through, which are not widely appreciated, but do show that the world's getting better.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think for me, one of humanity's greatest achievements has been stopping children from dying. And I think it's often just something we take for granted now that most children survive. But in the past, that's not how it was, right? For most of human history, around half of kids just wouldn't reach puberty. They would die either very, very early in life or before they reached around the teenage years. Globally, that's now less than 5% of kids will die. And in richer countries, it's much, much lower than that, something like 0.5%, right? So this is a problem we've made just amazing progress on. And I think we forget that and it goes kind of under the radar and we kind of now just take it for granted. But in the past, especially because most women would have kind of 4 or 5 children, most women or parents would lose at least one, if not several, of their children. And of course, today that's just unimaginable for us. But that's one of the biggest achievements that we've made. And again, it's the same for maternal mortality. So in the past, it was just very, very common for mothers to die in childbirth. And we've made amazing progress, even just over the last few generations. So in the book, I kind of cite the statistics between the risk of my mum dying when she had me versus her mum dying versus her mum dying. And you're talking about 50 to 100 times difference in the risk of dying in childbirth in just a couple of generations. So saving kids and saving mothers has been a massive achievement.
And what about life expectancy? I mean, because there was old people in the past, and so it's a bit counterintuitive that life expectancy was some low number. But is that just because you have to average out all of the kids that die, or what?
Yeah, so the life expectancy has gone up by 40 or more years globally. Um, so
From
in so
what then?
so in the past it was kind of 30 or 40, and now we're talking about 70 to 80 as an average globally. In many countries, it's much more than that. And the argument's often made, and I kind of laugh when people say this, but they say, "Oh, it's just because we've got much lower rates of child mortality." Like, even if it was just because of that, that's still a massive achievement. But it's not just because we're managing to save kids. That has had a significant impact on life expectancy. But we can look at data for example, looking back of what was the life expectancy of someone once they were 50. So they'd already passed the dangerous phase of childhood and they were 50. What was their life expectancy, or 60 or 70? And even at these higher ages, life expectancy has gone up a lot. So even if you were 60 or 70, life expectancy has gone up by an extra 5 to 10 years. So it's not just because we've stopped kids from dying. Life expectancy has increased at all ages.
Mm-hmm. And what about hunger, malnutrition, extreme poverty? I mean, those are critical issues, again, which people just don't appreciate. People think that there's more famine now, there's more hunger, there's more malnutrition, everything's getting worse. What's the real story there?
Yeah, so on extreme poverty, so our economists measure extreme poverty as living on less than around $2.10 per day, right? So here we're talking, this is the international poverty line. So we're talking about very, very low poverty line, very, very kind of low bar. But there, if we look at historical data, around 1800, you're talking about 8 in 10 people in the world living in extreme poverty. So most people lived on the equivalent of less than $2 a day. That's now less than 10%. I think it's now around 9%. So we've made amazing progress there. As I said, that's with a very, very low bar, a very, very low poverty line. We've still got a lot of work to do in pushing people into above the other poverty lines that we define, like $3.25 or $4.10. But if you look at the share under those, that's also decreasing. So we're also making progress there. And when it comes to hunger and malnutrition, some of the long-term data on this is quite poor, actually measuring dietary intake. You don't really necessarily know what people are eating, but for many countries, we have measurements of how much they're kind of producing per person. And from that, you can kind of get an idea of food availability. And we know that that's gone up significantly over time. And even if we have reasonable data for most countries since the kind of middle of the 20th century, the amount of calories and protein and fats that we produce per person has massively gone up, even though we've had massive population growth over that time. So generally, food supplies are much steadier and much higher than they were, at least since the agricultural revolution.
Because I think it's so easy just to think of famines as kind of a modern phenomenon. Vandana Shiva, so she said that there were no famines in India in pre-colonial times. I mean, that's presumably just a lie.
Again, we probably don't have great. We've got on our own data. We've got data going back a few centuries, but not much further than that. But yeah, like one of the core issues of agriculture, it's very, very weather dependent, and weather changes all the time, and that makes agricultural systems very, very vulnerable, right? One bad harvest and also most people worked in agriculture, right, since agricultural revolution. So most people's incomes and their food supplies were completely reliant on this very temperamental system that was very exposed to the weather. And over the last 150 to 100 years, our agricultural systems have become much more resilient due to many different technological changes. But prior to that, they were very, very vulnerable. So I find it very, very hard to believe that even more than a few centuries ago, we had these lovely, stable food supplies. We had very, very generally low food supplies. And I think that they would be very, very fluctuating depending on harvests and etc.
I mean, it's obviously a lie. There's famine in the Old Testament of the Bible, with complete with cannibalism and all sorts of horrific things. So the idea this didn't happen in the past is completely ahistorical. But what about inequality? Because we're in a world now where even President Biden was, before he retired, was talking about oligarchs now, the US becoming an oligarchy. So we've got these billionaires, without naming names, who seem to be ever more powerful. Presumably, this is the one indicator which goes against your trend of things getting better, right? We're getting less and less equal, poorer getting poorer, the rich are getting richer, right?
Not quite. I think it's a bit more complicated than that. I think there's a story around global inequality, and then there are many different stories around national levels of inequality. So if you look at global inequality, I think the general story is, for most of human history, we were actually very equal, but we were very equally poor, right? So most of society, most of us were in the having less than equivalent of $2 a day and not having enough food to eat category. And then over a century or two, there was very much a kind of splitting of the world into this very, very unequal world where Europe and North America predominantly kind of ran away, got much, much richer, and a lot of the rest of the world were kind of left behind. So you had this very, very unequal world. And what we've seen, especially over the last 50 years or so, is actually a closing of global inequality, where many more people have come up from the bottom, so come up from the kind of depths of poverty, where if you were to visualize it as a kind of distribution, you used to have two humps, where you had a rich hump and a poorer hump. And now you've just got much, much more people in the middle, right? Okay, and you still have kind of tails at either end for the very rich and the very poor, but predominantly most people are kind of sitting in the middle. So there has been a closing of global inequality. Having said that, there are many different patterns of national inequality, and there the picture is very varied. Some countries have actually got more equal over the last 50 years or so. Some have got much more unequal. And then I think the final thing to say there is we usually measure kind of national inequality based on what's called the Gini coefficient. That's a different measure.
Gini, isn't it?
Gini. Yeah. And that tells a very, very different story depending on the country that you're in. But the one metric which is quite unequivocal is just the share of income and wealth going to the top, the very, very top, so the top 1% or even the top 0.1%. And that has definitely gone up significantly over the last few decades. So that's one trend that's gone very, very much in the opposite direction, but it's a much more varied pattern when you look at it at national levels.
Okay, so I'm not completely wrong then. There are more... Well, the oligarchy and the sort of billionaire class does seem to have got more powerful, and the world has got less equal, at least at that individual level.
At the very, very top, yeah. At the very top, yeah.
Okay, let's look at the environmental side of the equation, because, it's one thing for humans to be improving their lot, but that's probably at the expense of the natural world, because we're taking more from the planet to make our societies richer. So, looking at some of those indicators, we've done climate already, perhaps, but let's look at, deforestation.
So, deforestation globally looks to have peaked in around the 1980s or the 1990s and has since fallen a bit. Deforestation is clearly not at zero, right? So the world is still losing forest. And we would really need to step up our efforts if we wanted to reach this target of zero deforestation in 2030, right? We're still very, very far from that and have a lot of work to do. But we are past the peak of global deforestation, and rates have been falling over the last few decades.
Okay, air pollution?
So some of the air pollution story is actually very, very positive. Again, we've passed the peak globally in terms of emissions of local air pollutants. Here we're not talking about CO2 or greenhouse gases, but local air pollutants, which are really, really bad for human health and have a massive toll, right? So we're talking about in the order of kind of 4 to 8 million premature deaths every year from air pollution. So it's a huge, huge environmental and health problem. But we actually have made a lot of progress on it. Globally, we're past the peak. And if you're to zoom in on many rich countries, and if you're to look at the kind of epicenter of industry in many of these cities, rates of air pollution are way down. So I'm in Edinburgh. Rates of air pollution here are way down on where they were a century or two ago. Same for London. Even if you look at China, like China's progress on air pollution over the last decade or two has been quite phenomenal, where they've slashed levels of air pollution by more than 2/3 in less than a decade. So many countries are making a lot of progress on air pollution. In some sense, you and I are probably breathing some of the clearest air in many generations. But we still have a lot of work to do to get every country to that level and reduce these millions of deaths to much lower.
Yeah, in South Asia, I mean, our Bangladesh office, Arif Hussain there is always reporting on just how terrible things are in Dhaka, where it's just extreme levels of pollution, and it's the same, I think, in Delhi a lot of the time. So are they just further behind on this kind of development curve?
Yeah, I mean, air pollution tends to follow this framework, which is called the environmental Kuznets curve. Now, I think there are many metrics that we wish followed this curve and don't quite, the data doesn't quite fit that curve, but air pollution is one that does. And it's basically just an upside down U. Whereas countries industrialize and develop and people get access to energy, generally outdoor air pollution levels rise. And then they reach a peak, and they reach a peak because people's kind of energy demands have been satisfied, because priorities shift, right? Once you have many of these basic necessities, you do just start to care more or are willing to accept trade-offs for cleaner air or other environmental pollutants. So then after countries have reached that peak, then they kind of put more focus on reducing pollution and rates start to come down. So rich countries are well past the edge of that curve. China's probably just past the peak and is now on the downward slope. And you can imagine countries like India or Bangladesh are still kind of on that upwards part and maybe haven't quite reached the top or the pinnacle. And the big challenge, I guess, is for us to understand or learn from the experiences like the UK or the US or China went through, to understand, are there things that we can do to accelerate that curve such that India or Bangladesh or any other country can go through it much quicker than we did, right? Ultimately, if you go through it quicker, then you save lives from air pollution. So that's one thing that I'm interested in. Can you transfer lessons such that lower income countries can go through a much shallower and a much faster trajectory than the UK or the US did?
Okay, so the bad idea that we have you saving the world from in this podcast is that everything's getting worse. But there's a kind of couple of sub-bad ideas that you really spend a bit of time on in the book as well. I think one is depopulation, the other's probably degrowth. Both of these, I think, are really, really fascinating, and I want to spend whole episodes on these. But give us the depopulation story, because when Paul Ehrlich wrote The Population Bomb, I think global fertility rate was probably at its peak, so he was just kind of unlucky in that he extrapolated it being the same forever, and it would keep on going up. But just give us that story really of how you see the depopulation issue.
Well, I think you can maybe say that Ehrlich was unlucky, but he's done recent interviews where he's seen the downwards curve and he holds the same opinion, right? So that part of it's not unlucky. He's kept the same opinion even though the outlook and the data has dramatically changed.
What's the word for that then?
Stubbornness, I think.
Like refusal to change his mind when the evidence changes. Yeah. The opposite of J.M. Queen's quote.
Yeah.
So tell us about like depopulation now, how that issue is.
I mean, so an argument that has gone on for a very long time is that the problem of environmental problems is just too many people, and if we just had fewer people, that these problems would disappear and go away. And the reality there is that, and I think the issue there, or the issue I often had with Ehrlich's work, is that you would then reach for, in some sense, very inhumane methods in order to control people's decisions around how many kids they could have, or shaming people into not having kids, or I think at one point it was suggested put sterilants in the water against people's will, or have kind of forced sterilization.
Or sterilizations in India,
Yeah.
which was often, well, I think it was partly attributed to Ehrlich's work at least.
Yeah. So it's not just the kind of hypothesis that population is a problem, but also the what spills over from that, which is kind of, in my sense, kind of inhumane methods to control population. And the reality when it comes to population growth is, yes, we've had this big burst and drive of population growth, very, very fast population growth over a very short period of time. But the reality is that population growth is now slowing. And actually, the rate of population growth peaked in the 1960s, as you said, and has now been falling. And if you look at projections towards the end of the century, most demographers think that the world population is going to peak. We'll maybe add another billion or two before then, but it'll peak and start to fall by the end of the century. And the basic reason for that is that women are having fewer kids. So fertility rates in the past were around 5 or 6 per woman, and the global average now is just above 2, so between 2 and 2.5. And there are a variety of reasons for why women are having fewer children. But what we do know is that lifting families out of poverty, giving women access to reproductive decisions, falling child mortality plays a role, letting women go to school and get an education, giving them rights to work and giving them opportunities. Those are all effective in reducing fertility rates. And my argument is you don't need a climate or environmental argument to put that forward, that should be like a basic right that women should have. We should do all of those things. And as a byproduct, fertility rates in countries where fertility rates are high will fall anyway. But we should just do that because that's a good idea and women have the right to these things. And you don't need to reach for forced sterilization, or you actually don't need a climate or environmental argument at all in order to convince people to have fewer kids. This is a natural demographic transition that's already in motion. And you would actually need to, I guess, turn that dial very, very hard to get a really rapid shift in population growth and demographics that would be able to solve the environmental problems on the timelines that we're talking about, right? There's very, very little that you can do to demographics to shift the number of people in the world by 2050, which is what we're aiming for to get to net zero. It's just not going to shift within a few decades.
So unless you kill like 500 million people, or
right,
something.
Unless you reach for extremely inhumane methods, right? So to me, it's just a kind of non-starter as an argument, and just doesn't make sense.
But so, I mean, like, it wasn't that long ago. I remember 6 billion. That was in about 2000 when I was starting out my first climate books. And, now it's 8 billion, which back then would have seemed inconceivable that we could have a world of 8 billion, which is more or less doing okay. I mean, according to your indicators, things haven't got suddenly catastrophically worse in the last decade or two. And we're looking at, 10 to 11 billion in the 2080s, according to these forecasts. Is there any wiggle room in that? Is that pretty much baked in just with the number of children that are being born?
I mean, the projections. So the UN every 2 years releases its projections for future population, and the last 2 revisions that it's done, it's lowered peak population and it's brought the timeline forward a bit. Right. So if you go a few editions ago, it didn't think that the world population was going to peak by 2100. It was going to be very, very slowly rising then, but it wouldn't peak. The next one, it was peaking in 2086. The next one, it's been peaking in 2084. So that timeline and the number of people that it would expect to be at that peak has been coming down and coming sooner. And that's just because fertility rates have been falling quicker than demographers had been previously projecting.
So we've already passed peak child, I think it was 2017, wasn't it? So
yeah,
there will always be fewer children then, which almost seems sad to me, but environmentally we're meant to see this as a good thing, right? How about degrowth? That you do I'll just remind people who haven't seen the book, you did a redistribution experiment in the book where you said for everyone to live like Denmark, so Denmark levels of kind of wealth and equality, you'd need 5 times increase in global GDP. So this idea that if we simply remove the wealth from the billionaires and distributed it evenly, we wouldn't all end up like Denmark. We'd probably end up more like North Korea, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think there's often an argument that globally the world is rich enough and we just need redistribution. And of course, poorer people need to be richer, but richer people can get poorer and we can somehow sort this out at a global level. How the politics of this would work, I have no idea. But
even the maths, so let's look at the maths, never mind the politics.
But even if you look at the maths, as you say, so this was actually, Max Roser did this for an article for our own data. And if you look at Denmark, you can pick any country, but you pick Denmark because Denmark is kind of seen for people as a kind of pinnacle. It's a very equal society, right? You don't have high levels of inequality. So, and a generally high levels of equality, I would see as good. But yes, if we wanted everyone to live like Denmark with that level of inequality and that level of income, which means some people in the world would get poorer and some people would get richer, the global economy would need to be 5 times as big as it is today. And even if you're to imagine zero inequality, so like everyone had exactly the same, the global economy would need to double.
That's if everyone's on about 10,000 a year, right? Which is, right. I think most degrowthers would probably struggle to get by on that kind of income, but never mind. So yeah, that you still have to double global GDP for that.
Yeah. So for me, a scenario where the world economy does not continue to grow a large amount is just untenable. And I think so. And then there's the political side of this. Is like, even if you forget this is a thought experiment and actually try to bring anything like this to fruition, like politically, for me, it's just an absolute non-starter. I think even if you were to forget about this whole global redistribution and just look at some of the rich countries and say, like, would it be politically acceptable for them to start to shrink their economies? I even think politically that's also a non-starter. And I actually think in the last few years that's got even worse. Like, I just cannot imagine a leading party in the US running on that and winning, or even in the UK running on that and winning. I very much feel like the momentum in the opposite is in the opposite direction, where it's all about growth and it's and all about prosperity. And I think by promoting this message, we're very much going to come up against the kind of general societal direction and feeling. And I just don't see how that's going to be effective.
And when people feel themselves getting poorer and you get recessions and things which are degrowth, I guess, by anyone's stretch, you tend to get people blaming immigrants. And, we even had race riots in the UK a few months ago. And I think that's partly due to this kind of sense that people aren't as well off, and you cast around for someone to blame. And so the politics of that could be potentially really quite ugly. But the kind of trump card for the degrowthers is this very simple phrase: how you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet, right? Surely that's mathematics. Surely the maths stands behind that one at least.
I think there are 2 points there. One is, I don't know if you can have it on a I don't know if you can have infinite growth on a finite planet, but I think we're very, very far away from infinite, right? Like, maybe in the year 4000, we might be pushing the limits, but I think we're very, very far from the limits, because I think there's a ton that we can do on innovation, which brings me to the second point, that we're assuming that growth has to be tightly linked with material resources. And I think over time, that's been coming increasingly less so. I think for many countries, it's still a tight link. I think in many sectors, there's still that tight link. But I think there are ways that we can innovate our way out of that dilemma in many regards. And I think a lot of economies are growing not necessarily because we are digging up more stuff or using more resource, but because we are able to put different pieces together and create innovations that are actually more about our mental capacity or human capacity rather than physical and resource capacity.
Right, so you get decoupling, right? You get dematerialization, and you're already seeing peak materials use of various things. I mean, you talk in the book about fertilizer, there's land, probably concrete, steel, wood, paper, CO2 as well, I guess. Hopefully this fairly in fairly short order, and fossil fuels, and maybe even internal combustion engine cars. I mean, are these peak things real trends, or are they blips, or what's your view?
I think a lot of them are real. I think it's always risky declaring a peak because as soon as you say it's a peak, it somehow rebounds. But I think that for some, we're very confident that they've peaked and fallen. Like I think air pollution has peaked and is going down. I think that stuff like internal combustion engines, they're not coming back. Right? I don't see the trends going back up there. So I think on many of these metrics, we're either at the peak and we're kind of bouncing along a kind of plateau before we go down, or we're definitely on the downward trend. I think the argument that the rebuttal to that is, yes, even if we peak, the question is about speed and how quickly can you decouple, and can you decouple quickly enough? And I think that's a very, very valid criticism and concern, right? Like, we don't just want to peak CO2 and reduce it a bit, right? We need to do this on a pretty fast timescale. So I think the question is about speed and not necessarily about are we there or can we be there, because the answer to those is yes, but it's can we do it fast enough?
Yeah, I think they'd say the same for land use, right? I mean, we might be at peak land use in terms of the whole sort of aggregate picture, but I think you point out, I'd forgotten this, or I hadn't quite appreciated it, but, rather than looking at, so obviously moving to more plant-based diets is critical. People tend to eat more meat as their countries develop and they become more prosperous. So rather than asking for all or nothing veganism, I think you say just cutting out beef and lamb would halve world farmland use. So you could still eat pork, chicken, eggs, milk, fish. You don't have to go for the whole vegan thing. Just getting rid of beef and lamb meat would reduce our land use by half. And that would presumably, if we could rewild and regenerate those ecosystems over that land, that would totally transform the picture, both in climate sense and in terms of biodiversity loss, right?
Yeah, so I think we tend to just put meat, often when we're speaking about meat, we just put it into one bucket, but there are massive differences in the environmental impacts of different types of meat. And as you say, like we used to use a huge amount of land for pasture, for beef and for dairy and for lamb. And if we were just to cut out that and still eat chicken and fish and other products, we would use a substantially less land than we currently do. So I mean, and I think this was the balance that I tried to strike in the book, is to try and meet people where they are and not be unrealistic about the massive leap that they're going to suddenly make. I think for many people, jumping straight to veganism is just not going to happen. But offering people a kind of step-by-step process that they feel that they can enter in a non-judgmental way is actually much more effective at driving change and can drive actually much more substantial change, right? As I say in the book, having everyone cut down on meat is much more effective than a few % of us going fully vegan in terms of environmental outcomes.
So we have to get away from the moralizing and the shaming, I guess. And I mean, I fly a lot, right? I'm always going to conferences, doing talks or whatever. And in some ways it's great. I get to see the world as it is rather than as I might imagine it to be from behind a desk in the UK. But and my carbon budget from aviation alone is pretty whopping. So how do you and of course, whenever I come back from wherever it is, people always make snide remarks about, well, you're increasing you're making climate change worse, blah, blah, blah. How do you deal with the kind of moralizing that's attached to some of these things?
I try not to do it to others. I do still have an issue with like beating myself up about it. Right? I'm very, very strict on not being prescriptive to others what I think they should do. I've never told it I'm a vegan, and I obviously talk a lot in my research about the environmental impacts of meat. And I encourage people.
You are a vegan, did you say?
I am a vegan, yeah.
Okay.
And I try and encourage people, often by example or with the research and the data, to think about their choices. But I've never told anyone you have to eat less meat or you should eat less meat, because I just don't think that's going to change their mind. Like, me telling them to do that is not going to be the thing that moves the needle. They need to make that decision on their own. And I think there is just this issue of people feeling like their behaviors are being moralized or undermined in some way. But that doesn't mean that personally I don't feel like guilty often. Like, I am a vegan and that's helped a lot. I try to really limit flights. Like, I don't fly a lot. I say no to most conferences, etc. But occasionally I still need to take a flight, and I do feel quite guilty about it, if I'm honest. So yeah, there is a dilemma there. What for me, and one in how I communicate, but also how I feel about behaviors myself.
I think flying's like a third of cement or something. So I often say to people, well, have you reduced your cement use recently? Because you've got to keep these things in proportion, and there's no alternative to flying, really. I mean, I think Greta went across the Atlantic in a sailboat, but that's not really a viable alternative for most people's, in international travel. And shipping's just as bad. So jumping on a cargo ship and taking a couple of months is absolutely no better in terms of carbon footprint. So it really is a kind of all or nothing issue until we can get a technical substitute. And it really irritates me that people focus on the one for which there is no substitute rather than focusing more on the things we can decarbonize much more quickly. And you see this, in fact, in diets as well. Like, we're not allowed to have meat substitutes that are, that work, like Impossible burger or mince, which you can get in the US. We're prohibited from having it in the UK and in Europe because of anti-GMO fear-mongering, mostly promulgated by Greens. It seems extraordinary that they would oppose the substitutes, which would do so much, hopefully, to push people in the right direction.
Yeah, I mean, I think the ability to substitute is a key factor in this. And I had this discussion actually with Ezra Klein, and I think the way he described it, like, the politics of substitution are way more easier than the politics of restraint, right? So telling people, like flying, no, you can't fly or you shouldn't fly, is way, way harder than offering people a lower carbon alternative. And the reality is that for flying at the moment, they're often, yes, for shorter term travel, there are trains and etc. that you can get by low carbon. But for long distance travel, there actually is just no low carbon alternative at the moment. And I don't think it's likely that most people will fly less. I think that's just the reality. So we will just need to find a technical fix for that. And I think behavior change there is probably going to play a really, really small role. I think that's different for sectors or parts of people's footprints where substitution is really, really strong, right? People will just switch from a combustion engine car to an electric car because it's basically the same, except your electric car will probably run cheaper and you'll have less issues with it, right? Like, that's the reality. There's a very good substitute there. As you say, on food, when we get to the stage when there are really, and to me, and I would say this as a vegan, I think many of the alternatives have gotten much better and very, very close to the real thing. But when you get to the stage where people can directly replace their burger for another burger, people will just switch. But that's much, much harder when there isn't these direct substitutions that you can make.
In the conclusion of the book, you say lab-grown meat, dense cities, and nuclear energy need a rebrand. These need to be some of the new emblems of a sustainable path forward. End of quote. And reading that, I think you might be an eco-modernist. Would you identify as that?
I feel like the eco-modernist term has got a bad name recently, so I don't know if I put myself in that box. But no, I'm definitely we need to use evidence and we need to rely on new innovations to overcome these challenges. We won't get there via just sacrifice or people just doing the right thing for the planet because they care about the planet. Like, we need innovations that give people high quality solutions that they actually want, and then building the politics and the economics and the social change around that. But innovation will be really, really key to this. So if that makes me an eco-modernist, then I guess that maybe makes me an eco-modernist.
Well, the term you use is urgent optimist. Is that right?
Yeah.
And you say the world's terrible, but it's also getting better, but it can still be improved, which are three things that don't go well together in most people's heads. I think it can be really bad and needs to get better, or it can be really terrible, but terrible and getting better don't seem to work together. So it's quite counterintuitive, this narrative which you're actually pushing in the whole, the whole of your work, which I think is really, really fascinating to see how much progress you've made on that. But kind of final question just before we wind up, what's your if there was a kind of moonshot idea, right? Something that you wake up in the night and go, oh my God, this has happened, or this could happen. What's the one big environmental breakthrough that you'd like to see?
I think when it comes to these environmental problems, I've become much more optimistic about the energy side of things. Like, I think innovation is going well there. Costs are falling quickly for alternatives. I think on the energy side, we'll get there, and I think we could get there actually quite quickly. The side of the equation that is much, much slower, and I'm less optimistic about, is around food and around dietary patterns and meat consumption. And I think what's really, really key is that people underestimate how important food production is to not just climate change, but all of the other environmental problems that we face, right? People just focus on energy and fossil fuels, right? But when it comes to land use or biodiversity loss or deforestation or water pollution or freshwater stress, like, that's just food. That's food. Most of that is food. And I think that doesn't get the attention that it deserves. So I think the moonshot for me would be the technology, which I hope is lab-grown meat and can scale well, which will provide this direct substitution that people need in order to dramatically reduce their meat consumption. And that would have massive benefits for not just one, but 5 or 6 or 7 of these environmental problems. And I think the other thing, which I didn't do as much of and cover that much in the book, and I wish I had, is on animal welfare, where we are raising in really poor conditions and slaughtering more than 70 billion just land-based animals a year. Then there's the fish and the aquaculture. But just land-based animals is like 75 plus billion animals a year. And I think at some point we'll look back on that and think, God, or the generation that come after us will look back and go, well, what are those guys doing? That's like really horrendous. And I think a breakthrough like lab-grown meat that's cheap and can scale well would address the environmental problems and the animal welfare issues.
I completely agree. I love meat, and being given permission to eat pork. When I was reading your thing about lamb and beef being terrible, I was like, oh great, I can eat pork. And then remember, these are beautiful, intelligent animals with incredibly sort of highly developed social sense, and the idea that we just sort of just kill them horribly so we can eat their flesh is grotesque. And that, I think, unless we can deal with that issue as well, it's not just about land use, it's not just about biodiversity or any of these kinds of meta level concerns, it's actually about the suffering of real animals. And for me, unless we can solve that problem as well, so I agree with your moonshot. I think that's really, really well stated. Look, thank you so much, Hannah, for being on our podcast. I want to just finish by hearing about what your podcast is. You're doing one called Solving for Climate, is that right?
Yeah, so this was a podcast we started last year. And me and Rob, my co-host, we interview people working on climate solutions. Some of them quite near term and I guess well known, and others more kind of moonshot. Some of them will probably fail, some of them will succeed. But yeah, we speak to entrepreneurs and people working on developing solutions to this stuff. It's interesting for me. I'm from a very academic background and I do writing and data visualization and stuff. But I'm not heavily involved in the kind of business side of things or knowing what startups are coming or how people scale businesses. So for me, it's just interesting to get to ask questions and probe on that kind of side of things. So yeah, it's been fun.
Well, I mean, none of us are Hans Rosling. I miss Hans every time I think about him, and it's there'll never be another communicator like him. But you're an incredibly gifted communicator, and you're probably doing more than anyone to save the world from bad ideas. So, thank you so much for everything you do at Our World in Data and with this book and all of your comms work. And I wish you all the best for doing even more of this in the future.
Thanks very much, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much for listening to Saving the World from Bad Ideas, a We Planet podcast. We Planet's a movement of citizens and scientists dedicated to defending the science and solutions we need to save the world. Please do subscribe and share a nice review. It helps us spread the message. We'd also love to hear your feedback and suggestions at our email, podcast@weplanet.org. Please also join our podcast mailing list and we'll let you know when a new episode drops. Just go to savingtheworldfrombadideas.org or weplanet.org/podcast right now. See you next time.